So I come into my office in the morning, as I'm wont to do very early in the morning. I light it up, but it's not Dewey Freeman. It's my good friend from the UK, Ger Graus. Ger, welcome to the Elder Council.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
I've been thinking we've had just a lovely set of conversations over the last year and a half during COVID, and they center around education. You're, one of the leading lights on education, especially around early childhood and young people. We'll say young people. And you travel around the world speaking about the challenges, both for teachers, for kids, for administrators, for businesses, for all kinds of people. I thought you would be a perfect person to have a conversation around fatherhood and being a dad, but also being a son. When I say that, what comes to mind?
Well, it's an interesting one. It's a very interesting question. So certainly the being a son bit, there are very big gaps. Whereas the being a dad bit, I enjoy.
Mm.
I enjoy, but I also find difficult sometimes because for all the things that people tell us, and if you go on Google or Amazon or wherever you want to go, there are so many books written about parenthood and about being a dad, and in the end, I'm kind of finding that I'm still making it up as I'm going along, and I certainly haven't found the book that tells me all the answers. And I have 3 children, and every single time I've had to make it up as I go along because my eldest daughter is nearly 27 in December. My boy is 25 on Monday, and my little one is 17 only just. And the gap between the two girls in particular, the 27 and the 17-year-old, is enormous. We used to in my day, we used to talk about the generation gap.
Yeah.
Right? And what we meant generations. We meant my parents and me and their parents, etc. Whereas now I think we need to call it a kind of 10-year gap. Because the gap between, for all sorts of reasons, the gap between a 27-year-old and a 17-year-old is massive. It's massive in terms of their experiences. It's massive in terms of what they face in terms of technology, for example, and how they live their lives. And that's something that as a dad, you kind of have to get used to, that you're not bringing up girl one and girl two, but actually two very different people who happen to be related, but who've grown up in very different circumstances. And my boy is kind of in the middle there somewhere. So I look at them as my eldest daughter Anna and my son Tom as the pre-iPhone children, and my little one Imogen as the post-iPhone child. The one, I think the joke goes that the youngest one, Imogen, her first words were, "What's the password?"
It's like there's the difference between I think you and I are of a generation where we would likely say we're digital immigrants.
Yeah.
And your children are digital natives because they grew up with computers in the house. And I think that there's a new distinction, which is growing up with mobile in the house, where I have a computer in my hand. When we look at Gen X, my kids are Gen X. There was just barely a Macintosh in the home, and then they were out becoming adults. So they weren't raised around that. And so that's a challenge. One of the things that hit me as you were saying that was the difference of being, because what I want to get to eventually here is modeling behavior and how the kids watch us as men, how we relate as men. But I'm curious, the difference between raising a son and raising a daughter and what the distinctions have been for you.
It's interesting. I'd like to think that for me personally, there have been no or very few distinctions.
Ah.
I think where, however, this begins to play are in the expectations of others.
Oh, explain.
So one, from the child's point of view, society, people around us have certain ideas as to what girls should do and what boys should do.
Yeah.
So the very simple example, if you are a quiet, kind, polite, studious boy, you're a nerd. Because you're not throwing the ball or hitting something with a bat or whatever. And what I find is that, or found is that you have to deal with in a very positive way, and actually say to your children, it's okay to be different. It's okay not to be like others. It's okay not to be like what you see on adverts or what you see portrayed in, and that plays out in a small way and in a big way. So where I come from, the three are my children. The memory, I think you'll know what I mean by that, Mark, and many people out there will know what I mean. But the memory of holding your child immediately after that child is born is one of a love that I didn't know I had in me.
Yeah.
And that gets repeated 3 times, right? There is really no distinction. But I think the fatherhood bit and the looking after and guiding and steering and loving is often in reaction to others, not necessarily just in reaction to your child. So it is society's perceptions and what might hurt our children and what might damage or worry our children. And so my son, who wasn't the sporty type, but was much more the, I like a book, I like a movie, I have a terrific sense of humor, which is well beyond my age. That was something that at times for him was not easy.
I'm curious, is that I don't know if in the UK if you have the same thing, the nature versus nurture. So your son environmentally is surrounded by education and books. Just look at the picture behind you, and you're a teacher, your wife's a teacher, and the value of books and education and discourse and conversation is part of the environment in which he bathed. So is it that, or was there something in his DNA? I'm curious, as he's grown up, has that changed at all?
I think the role modeling thing is, one, I'm not a scientist. So if somebody comes along and says there's something in the DNA, I'll go, brilliant. If you tell me that, I believe, right? But as an observer, I will say that I think we are much more of a role model than we think we are.
Oh.
We are, and there is that brilliant saying in the Reggio Emilia approach, which is an approach that is about early years learning and early years play. And Carla Rinaldi, the co-founder, expresses this as the environment is the third teacher. So after adults and other children, the environment is the third teacher. So if you grow up in a house full of books, by the law of averages, there is a fair chance that you will pick up a book and that you will have some interest in some reading, not necessarily my books, but other books. And I remember Anna, my eldest daughter, using the books when she was very little, before she could read, using the books for 2 things. One, to build castles to play with her dolls in. And secondly, to pick up and come up in the evening and go, this one, please. And that was the one that you then, or I then read to her. And it's the same for the others. So I think the environment is also a role model. And we are. And I think what we've got to remember is that role models are it's not as big a deal as we think. It is about leading by example. So if I go to my favorite school in the world, which is Arbethorne Community Primary School, right here in Sheffield in the UK, and the school finds itself in one of the most socioeconomically disadvantaged areas of the United Kingdom. And that immediately in some people triggers certain pictures of what the children therefore must be like. Yeah. When I go into that school, I walk into, I love it. I love every minute I spent in that school. So I walk through the door and the first child will say, "Good morning, how are you?" And I will say, "I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for asking." That child will then open the door for me. And then I walk through the corridor and every child I meet will say, at least will say, "Good morning." Most of them will ask me how I am. And in many ways, they don't know me from Adam. Every time I get to the door, they will open the door for me. And they have not been taught that. That has been modeled. They have learned that. So nobody ever sat down with a book and went, and when somebody walks up there, you need to open the door. And when somebody comes in, you need to ask this. Because all the adults in that school, all the adults, not just the teachers, do that in that school all the time. You pick it up, just like the books in the house. Yeah. So the role modeling thing is, so sometimes, you know, when we talk about role models, actually what we're talking about in our minds are superheroes, quite often. No. Yeah. But actually the role modeling thing, more often than not, is everyday common behavior that, so we need to be conscious as adults that everything we do is watched. And everything we do, there's a high likelihood it will be copied. So if I speak to you aggressively, or if in the home, the two adults speak to each other aggressively, we should not be surprised if the children speak aggressively to other people. Nobody explicitly tells them to do that, but we copy. We all copy. We still copy.
How early does that start?
Now, my global research in terms of children's behaviors and choices they make concluded, and it was a big piece of research, it concluded that all stereotypes were set at the age of 4 and probably earlier. Now, stereotypes is in a way is a consequence of role modeling. If all women wear pink, eventually all 2-year-old girls will want to wear pink. Yeah. So I would certainly say well before the age of 4. And actually one might argue from the second they're born. I walked into a park here quite a while ago, before COVID, and it's a beautiful park. It was a nice day. I was with my youngest daughter. We were having an ice cream, and in the corner of that park is one of those, you know, toddler climbing frame things. Yeah, and there was lots of mums and dads there, and they were all having their Costa Starbucks or whatever it was. It was a nice day, and the children typically that were with them were probably somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, I would guess. Every time the little girl goes near the climbing frame, all the adults go, "Careful, darling, careful. Don't hurt yourself. She's such a pretty thing, you know. Don't hurt yourself." Every time the little boy goes near the climbing frame, everybody goes, "What's taking you so long? You should have been at the top by now." Now, if that happens to you when you're 18 months, and that continues for the next 10 years, how do you think you're going to turn out? So we need to, in this very busy time, in this very busy world, we need to find time to reflect on how we behave and how it's copied sometimes. And another example is my eldest daughter. Until she was 4, everything in Anna's world was daddy, 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 daddy. And then she started going to kindergarten, and the day she went back to kindergarten, she came back and went, "Mrs. Poole, Mrs. Poole, Mrs. Poole, Mrs. Poole." And I'm going, "Who's this Mrs. Poole? And what's happened to daddy, daddy, daddy?" And Mrs. Poole wasn't the teacher. And Mrs. Poole had become more important, only temporarily, I hasten to add, but Mrs. Poole had become more important, and because, so you observe and you copy, you observe and you copy, and we all do it, don't we? Even us as members of the Elder Council, we still copy.
Yeah. I want to take us back to the park, because one of the things I've noticed as a digital immigrant, as technologically savvy as I am, I still have very old I won't say old notions. But it's just different. I am curious, as you looked over at those parents, how many of those parents were looking at their phone and not at their kids?
A good number, I would think, and I think it's an interesting thing, Mark. I think that we are at a point in our technological behavior development whereby we haven't caught up. Our behavior hasn't caught up with the technology yet. So we don't know quite what to do with it, because this thing demands that we look at it all the time. And we haven't found our way to behave around this technology yet. And I think there are some very good examples. So the park is a good example where the parent will go, what's the text message that's just come in? But also I remember, this is a good few years ago, when I had an office at Manchester Airport, and the CEO at Manchester Airport, who was my chairman, brilliant man, Jeff Muirhead, said, we want to equip you at home with a computer and everything that you need and access to the internet. And I said, thank you very much. But I also thought at the time, so now when does my working day begin?
Right.
And when does it end? Because Jeffrey, if you spend $5,000 to put kit into my house, and you sent me an email at 8 o'clock at night, I'm assuming you expect me to reply. So that's a professional example of how we have not moved to correct or adjust, whatever the right word is, our behaviors. So my view on technology overall is, everybody, when it comes and when the new invention comes, everybody says, this will make our life better and easier. I've yet to see that in many ways, because I'm busier than ever, as you are. And sometimes, as you know, I forget what time it is with you, and I might send you a message at a time that is wholly inappropriate.
We do that to each other all the time. But I'm thinking of this child, though, who's some people have called this the attention economy. And I'm thinking about the child wants to get attention, right? So now the child is saying, hey, pay attention to me. And the adult is, just a second, darling. And they're answering a thing, just a second. And because you study this, I can't help but think that this has a negative impact on an entire generation and subsequent generations. Am I overstating, or?
Yeah, I think the answer probably is yes, but there is a point. I remember when I was a child, my parents going, wait a minute, because they were talking to another adult.
Yes.
Yeah. So every child will have been told at some point, wait a minute. So that first and foremost. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but this is nothing new. Right?
Yeah.
I think, and technology in itself, imagine if the parent turns around to the child, which I do with my youngest daughter quite a lot. We go, there's something funny. Have you seen this? And then you laugh together because you share that moment. Right? So I think, or maybe I'm kidding myself, but I think that's an okay use of technology, because you're sharing it, it becomes a conversation piece. I think where the technology replaces the child in terms of attention, people have got their priorities wrong. And I think people, maybe technology gives us more of a chance to get our priorities wrong. I'm not denying that, but I think it's also always existed. And if you're a parent, hard as that is, really hard, because we're busy and we're trying to earn money and we're trying to pay for this, that, and the other. And your first priority should always be your children. And you should put, you're quite right with your example, on many an occasion, you should put the phone away and go, what is it? But it's a balance thing. And it's all, I think sometimes, Mark, I look at the world and I think, oh, you know, you hear these stories and you think all these problems are new. Yeah? They're not. They're always on the phone. You know, they're always on the phone. Even when they've come out of school, immediately they're on the phone to their friends. Go back 50 plus years, when I came back from school, the first thing I did was sit on the stair and ring my mates. And my mother used to say, you're always on the phone, and it was the same response. The only difference was my phone was attached to the wall and I couldn't walk around with it. So I think some of this is just not new. And there's that brilliant quote from my favorite book, The Little Prince, by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which says, all grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it. So I think we should take a bit, but it's complicated, right? Bringing up children and being a parent, being a dad it's brilliant, but it's not easy. But then I suppose it was never meant to be easy either.
Yeah, well, I didn't get an instruction manual. I was a young dad because I wanted to be a young grandfather. I am now a young grandfather, and I do not waste any minute. Every minute to me is precious with my grandchildren, because I know for a fact that minute will be remembered when they say to their grandchildren, my granddad did whatever it was. And in this idea of an attention economy, and it's only because I'm an elder. It's only because of that I know how precious that is. And so I go out of my way. I had my grandson for, it was just for 2 hours this last Sunday, and I cook on Sundays. And I said, this is perfect. We're going to go to the market. And I introduced him to the butcher and the produce woman and the grocer and the checker. And we had conversations. I didn't rush. I want to get the shopping done quickly because I want to go on. But here's a training opportunity. Not only is it build a relationship with someone who normally is transactional, we have a relationship now. Let's go and sit and let's look at the different kinds of apples. What makes these potatoes different? All of that stuff. And I don't think his mom does that, but she knows I'm doing that, right?
I think that's really important. I think there is this issue, isn't there, that granddads have the time.
Right.
I mean, if I look back when I was a parent, did I spend enough time with my children? No. Why did I not spend enough time with my children? Mostly because I was running around doing things, trying to earn money, do this, that, and the other, all the other bits. So when you're a granddad, I think that, I remember my grandfather with immense fondness, loved him, still my favorite family member on earth. Yeah, in that sense. But because he was retired, he had the time. So whenever I turned up, he would take me for a walk. We would go in the garden. He would tell me stories. And I never got that elsewhere. And I don't think I've given enough of that. But then, there's a balance thing. You can't beat yourself up about that either. You can, it's the old adage. If I look back and say, is there anything else I could have done? I'm kind of thinking I did my best. I tried really hard. And I think I passed. Sometimes I pass with flying colors, but it is the balance thing, isn't it? And the grandparent thing is cool.
It's my favorite. I mean, I distinctly made the decision when I was 12 that I wanted to be a young grandfather because my grandpa was old and I didn't get any of that time at all. And it's like, I want to be young and give that time. I want to shift the conversation a little bit around the 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 vibe that a young person gets in a home, you had said this earlier, when there's aggressive talk or there's aggression in the talk, the child is going to have that aggression. And I'm thinking, in when you introduce children into the relationship, the dynamic changes 100%, and either changes for the good or changes for but it does change. It's not a null event. And that when there is tension in the house, that everybody in the house feels that tension. You can't not feel that tension. And then they grow up in that tension. And I'm thinking about where it's most stressful is in that getting used to, oh, there's another human in the house to take care of. So between 0 and 4, I'm very, very cognizant of. When we say go to your room, or your mom and dad have to talk, or they can tell there's a fight, or there, all that stuff that happens, is there a way to say that while that's really important, the how we're showing up as a parent in that situation is probably the most important thing, and it's the thing none of us are thinking about. What is, how do
I
we,
agree. I mean,
that's a dilemma.
it is, but we need to be. I mean, there is this thing, isn't there, Mark, that we want to be treated the way we treat other people.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and we talked about the role modeling bit earlier, and I think you need to combine those two, and you need to be conscious of that. So yes, there may be moments, confrontations, annoyances, but you need to be constantly mindful that that young person who's with you, that little one becomes part of that tension, but also picks up on this and copies this as the role model. And it becomes then children become disturbed. This is not about, that bit about, I get this, and I used to get it talking to older people in the UK sometimes, where people would say, well, it never did me any harm. Well, it clearly did. So when people are talking about corporal punishment in schools, for example, I got a good hiding, it never did me any harm. Really? I actually refuse to believe that, because I think we lead by example, and you and I have talked about this a lot. My upbringing with my parents was a very unhappy one, because there was constantly the relationships were abusive, and amongst the adults, mentally abusive, and with the children, both mentally and physically abusive. And I'm kind of fortunate, I suppose, because what I did when I was old enough, I packed my bags and I left. And I didn't go back. And I promised myself that I would never be like that. But the reason I could promise myself that was because I was surrounded by other good people. Other people who I went and worked on a farm, I stayed with a farmer. Those people were good, decent people who looked after me and gave me those values to copy. And so we can never underestimate how this role model thing, and including the environment, has an enormous impact, both positively and negatively. And those vibes, you don't need to speak these things.
Right. That's what I'm thinking is that we feel that, like there's that somatic response to the environment.
There is. And what will happen is we will, if we're not very careful, this will get copied in a vast majority of cases. Just like in my favorite school, the children ask me how I am and open the door. That aggressive, bullying, unpleasant, abusive behavior also gets copied, because what we're giving those children is a tool, the tool they have. We're giving them the opportunity to make something the norm. And they can't decide at that moment in time what's right or wrong. But they know that we're the parents and that they copy. And that's not an excuse. I'm not the person who then excuses all sorts of behavior later on in those children's lives when they're grown-ups, because I think there are other points and there are other ways of making the right and the wrong decision. But we cannot, as parents, underestimate how important we are positively and negatively. And it is, tension is often unspoken, isn't it? It's more often, I think, unspoken than spoken, right?
Oh yeah, you can sense. It's like, in your relationship, you come home and okay, what's wrong?
Yeah.
Nobody said anything.
Yeah.
What's wrong? There's some, and kids learn that. Back to I don't know why this came to mind, but when I'm thinking about sending the kids to school, that I think there's a mistake. We're outsourcing our responsibility for role modeling.
Yeah. I think we're outsourcing our responsibility not just for role modeling. I think we're absolving our responsibility in terms of education. They can do that. I find some of that I find really strange, right? So of course, so in my case, if it comes to the maths or the sciences, I had to tell my children from a very early age, do not ask me a single thing, because I will invariably send you down the wrong track, right? But we need to understand that in the upbringing and including education of a child, this is a joint responsibility. The teacher might be seen as the subject specialist, but our children are in that teacher's care, in loco parentis, and we bring that child up together. We cannot absolve our responsibility. So one of the things I've always struggled with, maybe that's an English thing, I don't know. So when something's wrong in society, the mantra has become the school will deal with that. Right? So knife crime, bullying, the school will deal with that. Drug abuse, the school will deal with that. Then we have something called sex education. The school will deal with it. Some of this is problematic, and some of this is intensely personal. Now, what I'm not getting is, why aren't schools inviting parents and say, you need to come and join this? Yeah. And why aren't parents saying, if you're going to talk about my kid's sex education, I want to be in the room. Not to intervene, I want to be part of that, because it's really important.
That feels somewhat confrontational, though. As opposed to it being a collaborative experience, as you're talking about. I think the teacher who has the parent say, I'd like to talk to you about sex ed, the teacher's shields go up immediately. I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, and I agree. So we need to rewrite that narrative. And I'm not talking about sex education is a good one, isn't it? I'm not talking about the kind of the birds and the bees bit, the mechanics. Fine, the teacher can do that, right? That's cool. I'm talking about the relationship aspect of that. Yeah, because actually in English schools, it's now called sex and relationship education.
Oh.
Well, the relationship, which is incredibly important, and boys' attitudes to girls, and we know the stories that from, YouTube and whatever else, that what is watched, and that's changed in a number of cases, boys' attitudes to girls, etc. That redress is a joint responsibility. The school cannot do that on its own, and the parent probably needs the school's help. Those things are behavior, they're about values, they're about principles, they're about kindness, they're about respect. Why would I absolve my responsibility as a parent and say, the school can deal with that? I get the mechanics bit, brilliant, the school will do that really well, and you can pass the test and whatever at the end of it. I just think we need to think much more around what's education for, what's schooling for. Well, actually, I tell you what it's not for. It's not to serve the economy. It's to serve society, of which the economy is a part. because I just don't.
Go a little deeper on that, please.
Well, I don't just want brilliant geographers or geologists or whatever these people are, or surgeons. I want kind and decent ones as well. And I talked about earlier about opening the doors and saying, "How are you this morning?" That's part of the package, and the schools cannot and should not do that on their own, and the parents need support in that. You know, if our education, our schooling rather, is purely to serve the economy, how will a child understand the beauty of the arts? What lies behind it? So I think education and schooling are separate things. They both serve society, and society is about not what we are, it's about who we are.
Ger Graus, what a great conversation. What a perfect place to end that. And I deeply appreciate this. And for the men who are listening, I'd love, if you have questions, I'll make sure Ger gets those. And I just appreciate the fact that you have a completely different view of this problem, both from your personal experience, but because you travel the world and you meet teachers and you meet kids and you meet people who are having these relationships with kids. So you have such a unique point of view, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us today.
My pleasure, Mark, as always. Thank you.